There are places in the Canadian Rockies that still appear on maps as towns. Named places. Places with streets that had names, schools that had bells, and stores that had hours. If you go looking for them now, and some of them are genuinely hard to reach, what you'll find is something closer to evidence than ruins. Walls that stopped mid-construction, stoves still sitting in collapsed kitchens, a child's boot half buried under 30 years of pine needles. The mountain didn't erase these places, it absorbed them, and that's a different thing entirely. This isn't a list of ghost towns in the tourist sense. It's not about adventure or mystery for the sake of it. It's about what happens when human beings build something in a place that was never going to let them stay. And the very specific, very slow, very total way the Rockies take back what was theirs. 12 places, 12 stories. And by the end of this, the landscape itself will feel different to you. Most boom towns at least get to finish being built before they fail. Anthracite didn't quite manage that. This small coal mining settlement near Banff was established in the 1880s, at the height of the railway expansion push through the mountains. The Canadian Pacific Railway needed fuel. The mountains had coal. Someone drew a line on a map, put up some buildings, and called it a town. For a brief window it worked. Miners came, families followed. There were maybe a few hundred people living here at its peak. Not a city, not even a proper town really, but a functioning place with routines and faces and small daily lives. The coal seams turned out to be thinner than expected. The quality was lower than the railway needed. By 1904 the mine closed, the people left, and Anthracite, a town that never fully materialized, quietly stopped existing before most of the world had ever heard of it. What's strange about Anthracite isn't the ruins. It's the incompleteness. There's something unsettling about a place that was abandoned in the middle of being made. Like a sentence that just... The foundations are still there, scattered through the trees. Small rectangular outlines in the ground, filled with decades of fallen leaves. You have to look carefully to see them. The forest doesn't bother hiding them. It just grows over and through and around, indifferent to the fact that people once planned their lives inside these outlines. There are places on this list that went out dramatically. Anthracite just quietly ran out of reason to exist, and maybe that's its own kind of tragedy. There's a particular kind of unease that comes with a place where the records just stop. Fish Lake Settlement, tucked deep in the interior ranges of British Columbia, was a small farming and logging community that managed to persist long after most comparable settlements had already been swallowed by the province's economic shifts. People lived here through the Depression, through the war years, into the 1950s. And then, sometime in that decade, the last families left. No disaster, no single company closure, no official relocation. The records, what few records exist, simply trail off. The last entries in local registries become sparse, and then absent. The last correspondence stops. No one documented why they left. Or if they did, those documents haven't surfaced. What's left at the site is farmland reclaimed by forest, the ghost of cleared fields now thick with second-growth timber, a few structural remnants, and a silence that feels less like absence and more like something withheld. Communities disappear for understandable reasons all the time. Infrastructure changes, economics shift, people follow work. But Fish Lake leaves you with a question that has no clean answer. What did the last family know about this place that made them decide, finally, not to come back? Some places exist purely as hubs, no identity of their own really, just a function, a junction. A place where people and goods converged because the geography made it useful. Three Forks, in the Slocan region of BC, was exactly that. At the end of the 19th century, 3 separate mining operations in the surrounding mountains all needed a common point for supplies, equipment, and workers moving in and out. Three Forks became that point. For a few years in the 1890s, it was genuinely busy, not glamorous, but necessary. Then the mines around it closed, not one at a time, gradually. They closed within a short window of each other, which meant Three Forks lost all three of its reasons for existing almost simultaneously. A hub with no spokes is just a circle in the middle of nowhere. The town dissolved quickly after that. There was nothing to stay for, not the landscape, not the soil, not any independent industry. The buildings came down or were moved or simply fell. The site today gives almost no indication that something organized ever stood there. What Three Forks illustrates, maybe better than any other place on this list, is how provisional these settlements really were. They weren't communities in any deep sense. They were logistical solutions. And when the problem they solved went away, so did they. Sandown had a real identity. That's what makes its story different from the purely functional towns. They called it the Paris of the Kootenays, which, granted, was a lot to put on a small silver mining town in the mountains of BC. But in its late 1890s peak, Sandown had electricity before most Canadian cities did. It had hotels, saloons, a red light district, newspapers, and a population that briefly approached 5,000 people. For a mountain settlement at that altitude, at that era, it was genuinely remarkable. The first disaster came in 1900, a fire that destroyed much of the town. Sandown rebuilt. That's actually the part of the story worth pausing on, the fact that people chose to come back and start again. They believed in the place. The silver was still in the ground. The infrastructure was worth rebuilding. The second disaster came in 1955. A massive flood, the result of a blocked creek combined with spring snowmelt, sent a wall of water and debris directly through the town site. What the fire hadn't taken, the flood did. By then, the silver boom was long over, and the population had already collapsed to almost nothing. But the physical destruction of 1955 removed even the remnants of what Sandown had been. The site was essentially wiped clean. There's a kind of cruelty in Sandown's timeline. Survive the first catastrophe, rebuild, and then get erased anyway, decades later, when no one is even watching. The mountain waited. And when it came back for Sandown, it was thorough. A few foundations remain, part of an old city hall. Enough to tell you something was here, but not enough to tell you what it felt like to be here. That gap between the physical trace and the lived reality is the thing that lingers. Galena was silver, like Sandown, but where Sandown at least got to become something, Galena barely cleared the threshold from camp to town before it was over. The silver deposits near Galena Bay drew prospectors in the early 1890s. A settlement formed, as they do. First tents, then rough buildings, then something approaching permanence. At its brief high point, Galena had real commercial ambitions. Hotels were being planned, roads were being discussed. But the silver yields were inconsistent from the start. The infrastructure that would have made Galena viable, reliable transport routes, mill access, was always just about to arrive and never quite did. The timing was wrong. By the mid-1890s, investment had shifted to more productive sites, and Galena simply deflated. What strikes you about Galena isn't the ruin. It's that there's almost nothing to see. The site has been reclaimed so completely that you need historical records to confirm something was even there. No dramatic collapse, no iconic remnant, just forest where a street grid was once being drawn on paper. Some places disappear slowly. Galena disappeared quickly, and without much fuss, as if the land had never really agreed to host it. Briscoe is a slightly different kind of story, not a mining town, not a railway speculation camp. This was agricultural land, or it was supposed to be. Settlers came to the Columbia Valley in the early 20th century, looking for farmable ground at lower elevations, below the more brutal terrain of the high ranges. Briscoe was one of several communities that took root here, built around the idea that the valley could sustain real, long-term agricultural life. For a while it did. There were farms, a post office, a school, modest infrastructure, but genuine in intention. These weren't people chasing silver or coal. They were trying to build the quieter, slower version of permanence. What ended Briscoe wasn't disaster and wasn't resource depletion. It was roads. When the regional highway system developed, it bypassed certain communities and connected others. The commercial logic that had made Briscoe a reasonable place to settle gradually shifted toward larger centers. Younger generations left. Farms changed hands or were abandoned. The school closed. The process was slow enough that it didn't look like collapse while it was happening. It looked like normal rural attrition. Just people leaving, one family at a time, over decades. And somehow that's harder to look at than the dramatic endings. A town that was simply outpaced, quietly made irrelevant. Still technically on the map, but in a way that feels more like memory than fact. Nordegg is one of the places on this list that isn't quite fully gone, and that ambiguity is what makes it interesting. At its peak in the 1940s, Nordegg had nearly 3,000 residents. It was a planned company town, purpose-built around the Brazeau Collieries coal operation, and it had real infrastructure. A hospital, housing rows, a school, recreational facilities. The kind of town that, if you'd visited in 1942, would have felt permanent. Lived in. Real. The mine closed in 1955. Within a few years, the population had dropped from thousands to dozens. Most of the buildings were demolished or stripped. The company pulled back what it could. Today, fewer than 100 people live in Nordegg. Maybe fewer than 50, depending on the season. What remains is a strange hybrid. Some occupied houses, some historic preservation of the mine structures, and the underlying feeling that the town is being maintained more as an artifact than as a living community. There's a heritage site there now. Tour groups come in summer. And there's something quietly dissonant about standing in a place that functions, in part, as a museum of its own existence. The people who remain, the actual residents, are living inside someone else's historical footnote. What Nordegg asks is a question not many abandoned places get to ask. Is it better to be preserved, or is preservation its own kind of erasure? Lilla is one of the stranger entries on this list, because it was never supposed to be a generic mountain mining camp. It was built with specific cultural intent. The International Coal and Coke Company recruited French and Belgian workers in the early 1900s, and when those workers came to southwestern Alberta, they brought enough of their culture with them that Lille developed a distinct European character. A French-language community in the Rockies, at altitude, at the edge of the wilderness. It sounds improbable, and it was. The coal operation ran from around 1903 to 1912. 9 years. During that time, the coke ovens at Lille, beehive-shaped kilns used to process coal into coke for steel production, ran more or less continuously. The town had a post office, houses, a sense of its own identity. When the company folded, the workers dispersed. The French character of the place dissolved into the larger geography. The language, the community, the specific texture of life there. Gone. But the coke ovens are still standing. They've survived more than a century of Alberta winters, which is remarkable in itself. You can walk up to them, touch them. The stonework is intact, and there's something almost disorienting about that. This very specific piece of industrial infrastructure, rooted in a cultural identity that no longer exists anywhere nearby, still physically present in the landscape. Lila's story isn't just about a mine closing. It's about a transplanted community that existed in a particular place for 9 years and then scattered without a trace, except for those ovens standing there in the trees, waiting for someone to remember what they were for. Here's where things start to get genuinely strange. The Canmore area is one of the most visited parts of the Canadian Rockies. Hundreds of thousands of tourists pass through every year. The town of Canmore itself has become a destination. Boutique hotels, mountain restaurants, the whole apparatus of outdoor recreation tourism. And within the boundaries of what is now protected land, hidden behind the postcard version of the place, there are the remnants of a working mine that operated until 1979. 1979, not 1909. The Canmore mines weren't shut down by the Depression or by the frontier economy running its course. They were operating during the disco era. They closed because coal demand dropped and because stricter environmental regulations made continued operation difficult. The physical remnants of the mine, structures, equipment, the scarred earth, exist in an odd state of partial preservation, caught between heritage status and active reclamation by the surrounding parkland. It's not a tidy ghost town. It's more like a wound in the landscape that's been partially stitched, but not quite healed. The strange part is the coexistence. A few kilometers away, people are paying significant money to stay in luxury accommodations with mountain views. And here, hidden in the trees, is evidence of the industrial extraction economy that shaped this landscape for the better part of a century, slowly being absorbed, slowly being forgotten, but not yet gone. The mountain doesn't hurry. That's the thing. It just waits. Bankhead is one of the more haunting places in this entire ranking, not because of what happened there, but because of how completely it was unmade. The Canadian Pacific Railway established Bankhead in 1903 as a coal mining operation just outside the boundaries of Banff National Park, close enough to fuel the railway's mountain locomotives, far enough to avoid the strictest conservation scrutiny of the time. At its height, Bankhead had around 1,000 residents, a full complement of community infrastructure, and a sense that it was here to stay. The mine closed in 1922. And then the CPR did something methodical and thorough. They dismantled the town. Buildings were sold off and moved. Infrastructure was removed. The company town was systematically disassembled and its components distributed elsewhere. What's left at Bankhead today is a trail system, quite a pleasant one actually, that winds past the remaining foundations and a few preserved industrial structures. Parks Canada has done interpretive work there. There are signs explaining what stood where. But the thing about Bankhead isn't the ruins, it's the intentionality of the removal. This wasn't a town that fell apart organically. It was taken apart, piece by piece, on purpose. The CPR treated Bankhead the way you'd treat a temporary structure, erected for a function, removed when the function ended. Walking those trails, you're not in a ghost town. You're in a graveyard where someone removed all the headstones. The outlines in the ground are all that's left, and the fact that a human decision created this particular kind of absence makes it feel, somehow, more deliberate than any natural disaster could. On April 29, 1903, at 4:10 in the morning, Turtle Mountain broke apart. 90 million tons of limestone separated from the mountain's eastern face and came down in somewhere between 90 seconds and 2 minutes. The rock crossed the valley floor, buried part of the town of Frank under a debris field more than 3 kilometers wide, climbed 30 meters up the opposite slope, and stopped. When people emerged from the parts of town that survived, the slide had split the community, hitting the center and eastern section while sparing the western end. They found a landscape that had been fundamentally rewritten. The valley floor looked like the surface of another planet, white and gray and absolute. At least 70 people died, possibly more. The debris field was so massive that most of the bodies were never recovered. They're still there, under the rock. The Frank Slide, as it's known, was the deadliest rock slide in Canadian history. What makes it relevant to this countdown is what came after. The town was partially rebuilt and continued operating. People moved back. The mine reopened, briefly. Life resumed in the shadow of a mountain that had just killed dozens of their neighbors and neighbors' children in the middle of the night. That decision, to stay, to rebuild, to keep mining, is one of the more remarkable and unsettling choices in the history of the Canadian West. Some residents left and never came back. Others looked at the debris field every morning and went to work. The mine closed for good in 1917. Frank still exists today as a small community, living beside one of the most visible catastrophes in Canadian geological history. The debris field is right there, impossible to miss, impossible to normalize. Turtle Mountain is still considered geologically unstable in sections, and the people who died on April 29, 1903, they're still in the rock. There was never any realistic possibility of recovering them. The mountain became their burial ground. You pass over it on the highway, if you drive through the Crow's Nest Pass. Most people drive through without stopping. There are places that don't need a dramatic story. They carry weight through presence alone. At more than 2,400 meters elevation, in a section of the Rockies that requires either a multi-day approach through remote terrain or a long technical scramble, There is an abandoned mining camp that has no consolidated name in historical records. It appears in some archival documents under different designations: a claim number, a surveyor's notation, a reference in a private company ledger that itself no longer exists in any complete form. No one is certain exactly when it was built. Sometime in the early 20th century, based on the construction methods and materials. No one is certain how many people worked there, or for how long, or precisely what they were extracting. The records that would answer those questions haven't surfaced. What has survived at that altitude, in that wind, through more than a century of Rocky Mountain winters, is a cluster of wooden structures. Some partially collapsed. Some, inexplicably, still standing with enough integrity that you can walk inside them. Tools remain. Hardware. The remnants of a bunk arrangement. The hiking guides who know this site, and not many do, describe it with a particular kind of restraint. They mention the disorientation that seems to affect visitors there. Not supernatural, they're careful to say. The altitude is significant. The terrain is genuinely complex. Storms form fast at that elevation and arrive with almost no warning. But there's something else they mention, more quietly. The sense of presence. The feeling that the site carries more history than its physical remains can account for, that the silence there isn't empty. Stand at the threshold of one of those structures, and you're standing in a place where someone, more than 100 years ago, woke up every morning and looked out at the same peaks you're looking at now. They had names and histories and reasons for being there. The records that would tell you who they were are gone. The mountain kept none of that. Just the wood, just the rusted tools, just the wind that doesn't stop. That's what the Rockies do in the end. They outlast everything you bring into them. The ambition, the capital, the plans, the people, all of it temporary. The mountain receives it all and returns nothing except the landscape, unchanged, indifferent, permanent, in a way that human construction never quite manages to be. These weren't just failed towns. They were attempts, real attempts, by real people, to make something lasting in a place that had no interest in being made permanent. And if there's something to take from any of this, it's not that they failed. It's that they tried at all. That anyone looked at a mountain that could kill them, at a winter that could bury them, at a silence that could swallow them whole, and decided to build something anyway. The mountain is still there. The towns are not. And somewhere at 300-400 meters in the wind, those wooden walls are still standing. For now.